Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you're here, and we are going to continue our series that we started a couple weeks ago that we called Dare to Believe. And today we're going to talk about Dare to Pray. And that might sound like a really odd title because we'd like to think of prayer as something that we don't have to kind of rev ourselves up in some way and take a dare in order to do it. I'll explain why I'm calling it Dare to Pray. It's because the kind of prayer that I'm going to ask you or encourage you to participate in with us as a church is not really for the faint of heart. It's the kind of prayer that really takes God at His word and says, we believe this is what He desires, and we want to. We're gonna be faithful, and we're gonna persevere. Really, the kind of prayer we're talking about is a persevering kind of prayer. It's a prayer that sticks to it until the job is done. Not in vain repetition, but in faithful participation with God throughout the fulfilling of a given project. We're going to stay in the book of Nehemiah this week, and we're going to talk about this mountain-moving prayer and kind of take a look and see how in Nehemiah's situation this worked. Now, obviously, this is me going to Nehemiah's story with my perspective of this mountain-moving praying and looking and seeing how what he did fit into that model, so to speak. And so it's kind of going and saying, this is how I see what Nehemiah did fits into this model of this mountain-moving praying. And so I want you to look at, if you were not here a couple Sundays ago, then you probably have never seen this sheet. But if you were here a couple Sundays ago, you saw this sheet, and I kind of handed it out to you as a model for using, talking about praying with regard to mountains in our lives. And so we're going to use this model today and really in the weeks, months, maybe years ahead for some prayer projects that we have as a congregation. And so what I'm going to do is initially just tell you the story of Nehemiah, walk you through it. Pardon me. On the back side of your sheet, you'll see all of the scripture is listed there. Of course, you can open your Bibles and have it handy there with you as well. And they might throw them up on PowerPoint for you as we go through. But here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk through this. I'm not going to read all the scriptures. I'll read a few of them, but they're there for you. This is all taken out of particularly the first two chapters of Nehemiah and then some references back further. And so if you're going to be praying for with God, and you're going to join with God in this conversation, this communication, because really prayer in the simplest of terms is this. It's you talking to God or having a conversation with God. It's you talking to God and listening to God. And I think most of us find the talking to God piece of it a little bit easier, because we're active, we're doing. The listening is harder because we can't see God physically, and so we have a tendency to see the things around us or our mind begins to wander, and we kind of lose track. And it's one of the reasons why sometimes it's important to write some things down, to have a prayer that is written down or have prayer guidelines that are written down so that it helps stay on focus a little bit as you're either listening or you're communicating. So really, if you know how to talk to somebody, if you know how to carry on a conversation with somebody, you already know how to pray. Now, I know most of us have been in churches, and I'm not going to say it never happens here either. We certainly try not to. I've been raised around church all my life, and so it can be real easy for me to fall into churchianity, and that is just start talking church talk and church words and stuff that that make sense to me, but they may not make sense to somebody else. And particularly depending on what your background is. So I try to avoid that, and whenever I'm praying, I try to take as many churchianity words out as I can so that it keeps it authentic and real for me, because if I was talking to you, I wouldn't be going, how artist thouest? And I see that you're okayist, and I wouldn't be talking like that. So I'm not, when I talk to God, God doesn't speak Old English. I don't have any problem with Old English or that kind of thing. I don't have any problem with any other language. But the problem is this. The reality is God understands us however. In fact, it even says sometimes whenever we don't even know how to say what we're trying to say. If you've ever felt frustrated, like, forget it. I don't even know how to tell you what I'm trying to talk about. If you ever had that moment when you're feeling that way with your prayer to God, the Bible says that the Spirit will actually interpret that prayer, because he looks at the motive and the desire of our heart, interpret that prayer and offer it still up to God the Father. So it isn't so much about being so well versed in the vocabulary of church. It's not so much about knowing everything, the big words in the Bible that sound spiritual. It's not about that. It's about talking to God in a way that makes sense to us. Because however you talk to him, it's going to make sense to him. You can talk in Old English, you can talk in another language, you can talk, like a hillbilly. God can understand all of that. That's not a problem for him. What's the question is, what makes you feel like you're really talking from your heart? That's how we need to talk. The same as we would with someone we're having a heart-to-heart conversation. And so when you talk to God, don't think of the most spiritual-sounding person you've ever heard that said a prayer, that said our Father 15 times in his prayer, or said, a blessing and honor and glory 20 times in the prayer. That's not what you're trying to do. What you're trying to do is say to God exactly what's on your heart, what's in front of you, what you're talking about, and to say it in a way that conveys what you're trying to communicate. And you say, well, I hear people sometimes say, well, I don't know how to pray. The real question is this: do you know how to talk? See, if you know how to talk, you know how to pray. Now, I understand the fear of praying in front of other people, because that's something that kind of, if you're a little uncomfortable praying to begin with, then all of a sudden you're going to do it in front of other people, and especially if you're around some church people doing that, and you're going like, they're going to think it's awful. The people who thought they prayed the most awful prayers in front of me have been the most meaningful prayers most of the time that I've ever heard in my life, because it isn't practiced. It's not rote memory. It's just heartfelt. And when it's heartfelt, listen, God can hear any kind of prayer. He can hear memorized prayers. He can hear prayers that are, that you've memorized from Scripture or memorized from your past. That's all good. But what he really wants to hear is your heart. When we speak from our heart, that's what he wants to hear. So prayer is really a lot simpler than we make it. Now, there are different kinds of prayer. There's prayers where we're petitioning God about something. We're asking him, would he please do this in our behalf or someone else? There's times when we're interceding. It means we're praying on behalf of somebody else in some other situation. We're standing kind of in between that person and God, and we're praying on their behalf, and we're interceding. There are prayers of praise where we're giving God honor. We're saying, we're thanking him. It's gratitude, prayers of gratitude. And so there are all kinds of prayers, and I'm not here today to talk about all the different kinds of prayers. I just want to mention a few. But today, what we're talking about is mountain-moving prayer. And I don't say that lightly, because I'll be honest with you. Like I said, I've been around church my whole life. But up until really just a few years ago, when I would read in the Gospels, and it would say that if you even have faith such as a mustard seed, that you could say to this mountain, be moved, and it'd be cast in the sea. And I always looked at that as, honestly, that sounds really great, and I know God can do that. And, you could stand in front of one of these great mountains in the world, and I guess it would make a great demonstration of God's power just to stand there and go, hey, mountain, be moved. And that big old mountain just go and be like, wow, who would ever doubt God's goodness? But see, nothing else in the Bible conveys that's how God works. In fact, when people came to Jesus and said, hey, show us signs and wonders so we'll know you're from God. He's like, you haven't been following me around? You haven't seen these people healed? If you're not going to believe, if you don't believe what you're already seeing, me doing some miraculous something just to prove something to you won't prove it either. And so God's not into doing miracles just for the sake of doing miracles, or doing miracles just to stun people or to impress people. Every time God does a miracle, it's because he's accomplishing his plans, his purposes, his will. and acting in behalf of the faith of those who are engaged with his will. And so God never does anything to be spectacular. Because the bottom line is, if you are spectacular, you don't have to prove you're spectacular. You just are. And God is spectacular. And all you have to do is look at the universe and all the creation around. Look at your own human body. And God is spectacular. He doesn't have to prove anything to us. And so our point in prayer and mountain moving prayer isn't to prove something to anybody. It's simply to help accomplish the great things God wants to do. And so I have come to realize that there are mountains, most of the mountains that we face are not physical mountains that we're driving down the road and we have to all of a sudden pull out our great spiritual expertise and go, God, move that mountain there so I can get over that mountain the way I need to. That's not what we're talking about here, and I know you know that, or at least you're going, I didn't think that was the case. What we're talking about is the obstacles that appear before us in our lives through circumstances and situations that seem impossible. For us looking at it, we go, well, that would just be impossible. In other words, we don't have a solution today for it. You can't go, you say, well, this is a challenge in front of me. I don't have a solution today for it. I don't know, I don't have all the answers. I can do something today and I do something tomorrow, but it's not resolved. If you have, and I'll just give you a real practical example of this. For most of us, this is a mountain. If you have children still at home, anywhere from ages, 0 to 16, you have a mountain in front of you. And that mountain is called raising those kids. And raising those kids in a God-honoring way and in a way that is right for them. And the reality is, when you are handed that baby, there really is not an instruction manual. Now, I know God's word is an instruction manual, but I will have to tell you, there are a few things that I felt like got left out in the Bible that I had to still interact with God seriously about in the process. It was a relationship-based, ongoing learning curve for me. And so if you have children, that is a mountain. And the reason is because you don't have it all resolved. You don't know how this is going to turn out. You don't know what it's going to look like. And so certainly, and so God's not going to just move that mountain and tell you when that kid's 2 years old, this is what it's all going to look like and this is how it's going to be. You have to stay engaged. It's something that's a long-term thing. You're going to have to stay engaged with God on. And someday, hopefully, you can say, well, other than ongoing prayer and a little bit of input as they ask for it, we have a well-established adult here who is managing life fairly well. But here's something that I've also come to realize with this parenting thing. It isn't one mountain gets moved, but there is another one out there. Once a parent, always a parent. You always feel deeply what your children are experiencing and going through. Your responsibility changes, but your sense of acute awareness of what's going on in their lives does not, and your engagement with God hopefully does not, because I will have to tell you, my mom prayed so many prayers for me. To this day, she's been gone now for almost 7 years. I still feel my mom's prayers surrounded me at times, the results of my mom's prayers around me. And so don't ever feel like your prayers, are to no avail. They are, and they go on and on and on behalf of your children. Now, we better talk about the mountain in front of us, or I'm going to create a different kind of mountain, and that is, how am I going to get this service done in time? All right? That was really just stuff from my heart. It wasn't so much in my notes, but I just wanted to share that with you, kind of to give perspective. So we're going to look at what we have labeled here as a mountain, and it's found in, I will ask you to turn over or notice verse 3 of chapter 1 of Nehemiah, and it says this: they said to me, this is his brother and those who came, and he asked the question about how the Jews were doing who had survived and were in Jerusalem. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. So what was the mountain that all of a sudden loomed up in front of Nehemiah as he was having this interaction with his brother and with those who came with him. It was this: the burned gates and broken down walls of Jerusalem, the physical disrepair, which basically meant they were susceptible to any enemy, and the enemies were just coming in, robbing from them, stealing from them, controlling them, managing them, taking over. They had no protection whatsoever. And so then the second piece of that was, or the first, second, whichever, but the part of this mountain was the great distress and reproach of the Jews. Here these are God's promised people. They are God's people, and they belong to him, and yet they're people who are run over completely. There's a reproach. They're under reproach, and they're under great distress. And I think that Nehemiah, best I can understand, had some hopes or thoughts that maybe Jerusalem had started rebuilding, because there was a remnant left there that had not been taken into captivity when they were captured. And there was also a delegation that had gone back under Ezra. And so I think he had hopes there had been some progress made. And so he heard this report. So all of a sudden, in front of him, for him, that became a mountain, something that seemed impossible for him to do. Here he is. He's captive. He was one who was taken in captivity. He was one who had been given a job in his captivity. And his job happened to be, as we've mentioned before, the cupbearer to the king. So he had a prominent position in the sense of his proximity to the king of Persia. But at the same time, he was a captive. He was taken as captive. So he didn't have the freedom to just go, hey, I want to change jobs. I want to go in here and I appreciate, the job to be your cupbearer, king, but right now I'd like to do this. He didn't have that kind of flexibility. He was a captive. He was under complete control of this foreign government and the king that he served. So here's the next step whenever a mountain appears that I recommend that someone do, and you go down to the middle section here first. Ask God for directions. Get as clear of an understanding as possible about God's intent for this mountain. And so what was it that God wanted? And we don't hear so much God's voice in this. We hear what Nehemiah came to conclude that God wanted through his prayer. And here's what came to the surface in the prayer. He reminded God of the covenant relationship that God had with the Jewish people. He reminded God of that covenant. He's going, these are the people you've made a covenant with. And they are a reproach. Their walls are torn down. Their gates are burned to the ground. And they are living in distress. These are your people, the people you have a covenant relationship. That's what's going on, God. So he's reminding God of that and saying, God, what is it? What is it that you've desired from these people? Oh, that's right. You desired to have a covenant relationship with these people. These people you have a covenant relationship with, it appears as though that covenant's broken. And so a covenant relationship with God is what God had set out to have with the Jewish people. And also, he had made great promises to the Jews. He was going to bring the Messiah through them. There were various promises that were given to them. And so God doesn't make promises lightly. God wants to fulfill those promises. God was not having a problem with his part. What was going on was the Jewish people kept rejecting him, kept going their own way, and so then they would suffer the consequences of that, and God would allow them to come to this reproach. But God's desire for them was to be that covenant relationship. His desire for them was to fulfill the promises through them that he had made. That was his desire. So we believe for sure that's what God wanted. You read the story, you come up with something different, glad to hear it. But that's what I pull from this passage. What did Nehemiah want? Nehemiah wanted God's covenant relationship to be restored. He wanted the people to be back in that covenant relationship with him and to take the reproach away and the fulfillment of God's promise to gather the Jews to Jerusalem. And so just as Nehemiah mentioned in his prayer that God had said that if you disobey me, I'll scatter you, that God had also promised that if you turn to me, that I will gather you back from the far ends of the earth and you will be my people. And so God's covenant relationship to be restored is what Nehemiah wanted, in the fulfillment of God's promise to gather the Jews to Jerusalem. And so let's jump up to the left corner here of your sheet of paper, okay? And I want to put together, you begin to put together a plan of action that you can do now or in the future. So Nehemiah sets about, he starts off by, first of all, how he got into this. He asked the question. He asked the question. He said, how are things in Jerusalem? In verse 2, how are they? Could I just say, be careful of what questions you ask? Because depending on what the answer is, you might get pulled into something you weren't thinking about. Nehemiah, as I mentioned, I think last Sunday, the man was in a comfortable place. Now, I mean, being up close to the king had its downside, but being up close to the king had its upside, especially being the cupbearer. This guy was eating and drinking well. His life was pretty nice. The place they were at right at this point of this happening was in sort of a resort area where the king would spend in this a season of the year. It was a very, very lovely place, and so he had it pretty nice. I mean, he had a pretty cushy job. He was in a pretty comfortable place, but he asked a question. He asked the question. You know, sometimes I think the reason we don't ask how somebody's doing is because we may not want to know. You know, and truthfully, if every person we ask, you know, because sometimes we'll meet total strangers and we'll go, so how you doing today? We know we don't really mean that, because if they truly stopped us and shared, well, I just got this report from the doctor, I just got, you know, and you don't hardly know the person at all, you begin to feel like, oh, I'm getting something put on me here. I don't know what to do with. I don't know where to go with this. I don't know how to help this person. But you have to be, if you ask the question, you got to be ready. It appears as though Nehemiah was asking the question because he really did want to know. He wasn't then all of a sudden trying to find some excuse I hope it gets better for him. I hope it all works out for you, okay? You know, because that's the kind of answer. If we met someone more on a casual basis and we asked them, you know, how you doing? And they start giving us this pretty serious issues, we'd probably somehow want to go, I hope that works out for you, okay? Okay, I got to get to work, you know, and we might hurry along. Nehemiah, of course, it was his brother and it was his nation, and so he was greatly concerned, but he didn't realize what he was getting into when he asked that question. So he asked the question. If there's something you don't really have interest in, maybe you better not ask any questions about it. But if you do, and you ask the question, be ready. God might give you a job. He might give you a task. And so he asked the question. Didn't have to, he did. And then he heard the answer, and it just hit him like a ton of bricks. And so you see here, several things happened. He sympathized. He felt sorry for them. He was crushed because of the things that they were going through. The Jews in that city in Jerusalem were going through. He empathized, and the reason I know he empathized is because when he started praying not only for the people that were in Jerusalem, he started praying for himself. He was feeling it himself. He was feeling the effects of that on himself. And then he fasted. And I would tell you this, anybody who's fast, they're serious. If you know somebody fasting, they're generally serious about something. And so he became very serious about it. And then he was praying. And in his prayer, he did some things. He reminded God of his covenant. And there's nothing wrong with reminding God of the things he said. God, you said this. You've indicated this is what your desire is. Because what we're doing oftentimes through prayer, especially mountain moving prayer, we're agreeing with what God wants. And we're helping to remind ourselves and God, this is what you said you want. And so Nehemiah is saying, you have this covenant. You made a covenant relationship with these people. Let's not forget that, God. And so then he begins to intercede for Israel. He prays on their behalf. And he prays even for himself and for all of Israel in verse 6 and 7. He confesses sins. Now, it's interesting. He didn't just confess that Israel had wandered away from God and turned their back on God. He confessed his own sins as well. His sins and the sins of Israel. He confessed them. And then he reminded God of his promise. He goes, yes, I know you said you scattered, and we've done it, we caught it, we brought it on ourselves, but you also said you'd bring us back. And so he's reminding God of his promises. And then he requests favor. If you notice, and I want to look at verse 11 with you and point this out. He says, oh Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name. and make your servant successful today and grant him compassion. Some translations may say favor before this man. Let this man have a heart to receive me. He's talking about the king. He's praying about the king. And he's saying, please, God, give me favor. Please give me favor. Then going on down for a couple more things here, when in chapter 2, verse 3, when he was before the king and the king asked him about his countenance, he spoke up. He spoke up. He didn't remain silent. He didn't act like it was something else. He spoke up and he said, this is what's going on. He told him and why he was heavy-hearted. And then as his interaction went on with the king, and it seemed as though the king was going to give him his request so he could go and do something about it, he asked the king for a couple additional favors. He asked God, he said, God, grant me favor with this man. Grant me compassion with his heart. Turn his heart compassionate toward me. And so in that moment, he's banking on the fact that God's going to hear that prayer. And he says to the king, he says, would you please send some papers along with me that I can show to the province leaders, the governors along the way, and show them that I have your permission to go through their territory and I'll be protected. And then he said, I want to ask you one more favor, king. If you could please give us some supplies. You know, you have this great forest out here, and you have this guy who's in charge of it. Could you give a paper that he would build the beams and things that we need, that we can help build this wall back like it needs to be? And he asked the favor, that king. He asked protection, he asked provision. Now, let's jump across. We're going to divide this into two sections. Let's jump across, and let's look at the section where what I call commit to staying engaged in conversation with God until the mountain is moved. So what only God could do. God will always respond to his people. Now, the reality is he doesn't always respond the way we want him to. Remember this, when you pray, he has the right to say no. That's still an answered prayer, okay? When God says no, it's an answered prayer. I don't always like it when he says no to me until probably about a year or two down the road, and I look back and go, oh, thank you, Jesus. I was about to mess that up 100%. If you had said yes to me, that would have been terrible. Thank you for sparing me of that. And so we generally don't see the benefit of God's no until it's 2020. You know, we see somewhere down the road, we look back. But so God responded. He responded to him. And his question was, you know, his request was, would you give me favor before the king? He gave him favor before the king. The king looked at him favorably and said, yes, I will let you go. And so the answer was yes from God. The answer was yes from the king. And then he says, would you give me further favor? Not just by the king listening to me, but would you give me favor that he would do some things? He would empower me in ways I can't empower myself. See, here's one of the things that we have to realize is there are times whenever we by ourselves are not adequate. We do not have the resources, we do not have the capability of pulling off what it is that's a mountain in front of us. And you know, going even back to the issue of being a parent, you know, one of the things that I realize is that God would bring people into my life to help me as a parent. God would bring books into my life to help me as a parent. He would bring advice into my life to help me as a parent. There were other things. It wasn't just between me and God. God would use other resources to help out with that job. It wasn't just up to me, and it wasn't just between me and God. It was there other things that he would do to bring into play that would help in those situations. And so Nehemiah, he was basically a slave. He was a captive, been taken captive. He was given this job, high-profile job, but he was still a slave. He didn't have the authority to go and rebuild the wall himself. He didn't have the authority to go through these other people's governed lands on the way, even though they were under this kingdom. He was a servant. He didn't have the authority to go to the woods keeper of the king and say, build me some beams. He didn't have any of that authority. He had no power. He was powerless here. Where he was powerless, he said, God, help make your protection and your provision work. I need your help. You're going to have to make this happen. And so God gave him favor before the king, and so the king sent him with protection. Now, I want you to look at verse 9, because this is not the protection that Nehemiah asked for. And this tells you this. sometimes God gives you a bonus, okay? Sometimes when you're really doing what he wants to, he'll give you bonus. I want you to look at verse 9 with me if you would. It says, then he came to the governors of the provinces beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. That's what he asked for. Now listen to this. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. Now think about that. It's one thing for Nehemiah to be standing there and going, hey, I promise you, the king really did do this letter for me. And they're going, yeah, right, who are you? He didn't just have some soldiers. He had officers from the military with him. Guys who had all those. You see those guys? Some of you guys probably have them, somewhere in your closet, or you don't wear them. I mean, I'm talking about decorated, like really, you can't even hardly. They walk sideways because they have so many medals over here on the side of their. That's the kind of people. Those are the kind of people that the king sent with him. He didn't send some privates. If you're private, that's cool. That's awesome too. Everybody has to start someplace, right? But he didn't send a private with them. He sent officers of the military. He sent the guys with all the badges and all the medals and all the stuff. And they're walking in here to these provinces where they have to face these governors. And they're going, you probably don't need the letter because we're here with them. It's just God sometimes surprises us with a bonus. And I'm just telling you, that's the kind of God we serve. We sometimes forget that. We don't realize that. But in this situation, God's going, yep, you're going to get protection, and you're going to really get protection. Not just in the form of a letter, but also in the form of officers. Then he was given favor to get the provision from the king's forest. Now, let's jump back over to the other side and go down to the actual situation of him getting to Jerusalem. In chapter 2 and verse 12, and I do want to read that verse to you as well. It says this. And I rose in the night, I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God. If you're with your sheet there, I'd like you to circle the words, my God. This wasn't something that Nehemiah dreamed up one day. This is, he says, I didn't tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem. That's exactly how a vision happens. God instills within the heart and the minds of people who follow him a vision for what he can do. Now, Nehemiah didn't go running around talking all about it. He didn't go around telling everything. He said he had not yet told anyone what God had put into his mind to do for Jerusalem. I'm going to tell you, that's what I call a God-sized vision. And if you think about it, a guy who's over here just sipping wine with the king and making sure the king doesn't die and tasting some of his delicacies and handed them to him and that kind of thing, I'm not so sure he had any experience or background in wall building or that kind of thing. I don't think that was his expertise. Obviously, was of the finer side because he was chosen in that kind of a capacity. And I don't mean that he wasn't a man's man or that kind of thing. I'm just simply saying he wasn't, I don't think he was schooled in all this stuff. So he was going to do something that was well beyond his capacity. The reason he was doing it wasn't because he was so knowledgeable, but because he was so available. He was so willing to allow God to do something extraordinary through him as an ordinary person. And I believe that's what God still wants to do in all of us. Now, this vision that God had placed in his heart, understand, if you look here at 11, here's how it kind of worked out. He assessed, and you have to read the verses 13 to 18 in chapter 2 to get it. But he assesses, he plans, he casts a vision, he organizes, and he oversees. Now, there's no question that Nehemiah had a leadership bone to him. There's no question. Probably naturally, he had a bit of a leadership bone to him. But the truth of the matter is, this is not something he was necessarily schooled in or educated in, but what he did was he made himself available. And between he and God interacting in this, he began to bring out and lay out what this plan was. He began to organize it, and he was willing to oversee it. Now, let's jump over to the other side, because that's what he could do. He could do those things. But notice, staying with verse 12, the vision came from God. Nehemiah, again, this wasn't just some brilliant idea he had. Well, I think I'll just go build a wall. This was something that God put in his heart, in his mind. The vision was something God can only do. And I can promise you, God-sized visions are bigger than what we can do by ourselves. They're bigger than what we can figure out in Tyler Race. We have a part to play. Nehemiah ended up being a very, very stellar leader. But his leadership came out of his deep connectedness to God and his awareness of what God wanted. So his vision came from God. God gave him guidance. God gave him inspiration. He gave him encouragement. In verse 14 of chapter 4, I do want to read that verse to you. I read it last time, but I want to read it again because it's so awesome. He says, when I saw their fear, I rose up and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Why shouldn't they be afraid of them? They've been run over by these people their whole lives. He says, remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Remember what I said in the prayer? That's Nehemiah's favorite phrase when he talks about God. He says, I want you to remember the Lord who is great and he is awesome. In other words, quit looking at your circumstances. Look and see who God is. God is not limited by our circumstances. His limitation is never held down by what we see physically around us. And so he's going, quit looking at these other people. Quit worrying about what they're saying about you. I want you to look to God, who is great and awesome. And I think we all have to be reminded of that when we're on task for God, it's not about who we are, and it's not about what we can do. It's about how great and awesome our God is. And yes, will God use us? Sure. God was using Nehemiah right there. He was using Nehemiah to be a person who was willing to stand and before these people and help them to see things differently. Was he aware of these enemies over here causing the problems? Was he aware of what they were planning against him? Absolutely he was. He just had to choose in that moment, in the hardness of his task, to look to one who was greater than those who were in opposition to him, and to trust and believe and help those people to have that kind of faith. And so God kept giving him wisdom. You look at his life and you look how it played out. He obviously kept gaining wisdom from God. He gained strength, and I have to read that verse to you too. I want to put that in here. Because, I don't care how good you are. I don't care how much faith you have. I don't care how much knowledge you have. I don't care how much you're convinced you're doing God's work. Do you think there's a slight possibility in the middle of doing all that you might get a little discouraged? You might get a little exhausted? You might feel like throwing in the towel? Absolutely. I can promise you, anybody who does a great work for God has had moments when if they could have felt clear before God, they would have walked off the job. They'd have quit. And some people do, and some people have. But Nehemiah, he wasn't too proud to ask God to build him up, to give him strength. And here's his prayer. He says, for all of them were trying to frighten us, thinking they will become discouraged with the work and it will not be done. So he understood their motive was to stop him from doing this great work for God. So here, what does he do? He goes, now, God, strengthen my hands. Strengthen my hands. There's nothing wrong with us admitting that we're weary, we're tired, we're worn out. We feel like we can't keep on fighting the battle. So sometimes the best prayer we can pray in the midst of that isn't to go, okay, God, move the mountain. Remember, we're going to move the mountain. Just to go, God, if you don't give me some strength, that mountain will never be moved if it has anything to do with me. Because I'm flat out exhausted. I can't go another step. But Nehemiah didn't say, let me out. He said, strengthen my hands. Strengthen me. Give me the internal power that I need to press forward in the midst of all of this opposition that's building around. We think a perfect world would be having no opposition whatsoever. We think a perfect world would be having a job where there was never a problem, having a perfect boss, having perfect employees. We think if our spouse would just get perfect like we are, world would be so much better, It'd be great if they could just be like I am, It'd be wonderful. If Angie's still working on that. No, she's here. I'm saying that for her. She knows the truth. She knows who the weak one is in this group. And so here's the deal. The deal is we have to admit whenever we're given out. Nehemiah wasn't too proud to do that. Even though he was made governor of this area, and he was given this great task, and great things had been happening, his pride did not get in the way of going, you know what, God? I've been standing up. I've been telling these people, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Be strong. Be courageous. Don't be afraid. You're a great and awesome God. But I will tell you this much, God. Right now, you better strengthen my hands. You better give me some strength because I'm feeling pretty weak. It's okay to feel weak. It's just you need to know where to go to get your strength. And he knew that, and he went to that resource. Now, I also want you to look at verse 20 of chapter 2, because the faith he had in all this wasn't something he drummed up himself. He didn't get up every morning and while he was doing push-ups go, I got the faith, I got the faith, I got the faith. He didn't drum this up. He didn't beat it. It was given to him. Understand, great faith isn't something you can just muster up. Great faith is something you have to ask God for. He has to give it to you. And I want you to look at verse 20, if you would. So I answered them, because here was one of his first confrontations with the enemy. I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. He didn't say, hey guys, you think you're all so cool and you're against all this? I've got a great plan. Oh, I have a great plan. You guys, you have no idea the great plan. I've sat down with some of the smartest people you could imagine, and I have a great plan, and you guys are toast. You have no idea. You have no idea how brilliant this plan is. You have no idea how well thought out it is. You have no idea how well executed it's going to be. We're on top of this game. You guys better run for your lives. No, he didn't do that because he knew that wouldn't have been the truth. He knew what God had placed in his heart. He also knew he had a bunch of people who'd been very beat down. He was going to have to get up into a workforce. And even though they'd said, hey, yeah, let's go, let's build. He knew the story of Moses and the children of Israel. He knew how they grumbled and complained. He understood how people were. He knew he had a massive task, a mountain in front of him to accomplish this. And so instead of being arrogant and cocky, he said, the God of heaven will give us success. If we do this, sirs, it won't be because the king sent me here. It won't be because I'm so smart. It'll be because the God of heaven gives us success. And since we are confident, and he's placed enough faith in me to believe that he can do this, I'll tell you what we're going to go ahead and do, sir. We're going to go ahead and arise and build, because we are his servants and we are on his task. We are doing his mission. We are moving his mountain. And as a result, we're going to go forward with it. You guys go ahead and do what you have to do. But we are serving the Almighty God, who we have confidence will give us success. And we're going to go forward. Now, I want you to look at the bottom of your sheet in the middle. This is what happened in chapter 6, verses 15 and 16. And the wall was completed. The enemies recognized that God had helped. The enemies didn't go around going, now those guys are brilliant. Now those guys know how to make this stuff happen. See what we ought to do. They've got some engineers we need on our team. Let's see if we can get some over here. They weren't giving credit to the people, certainly the people worked hard. They did work hard. And if without their effort, listen to this, without those people's effort, that wall wasn't getting built before. Understand, it was a companionship. It was a partnership between them and God. But because of the way God helped them and worked in their behalf, they were able to do something that seemed impossible for them to do for decades, had not been done. And so as a result, here in this moment, they had that spirit to rise up and build under the leadership of Nehemiah and his dependence on God, and the wall was completed. And the enemies, instead of walking around going, man, those guys are amazing engineers, they said, look what their God did for them. Look what their God did through them. And so they recognized it, and here's what happened. The enemies became afraid to bother them. They're going, I mean, if that lousy, good-for-nothing bunch of people over there that we've been able to take advantage of and run over and everything else, if they did this through the power of their God, we may better let them eat their own vegetables. We may better plant our own garden. We may better just leave them alone. Because if he helped them do that, we're not sure what he might do if we go bother him. And you say, Rod, does it really say that? Well, let's just look at the back of your sheet there and look at it. So the wall was completed on the 25th of the month Elul in 52 days. That alone is a miracle. When all our enemies heard of it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. I don't know if we can even comprehend how significant that is. But I want to always be a part of something that is bigger than me, that requires my input, my help, my part, but it will only happen if God shows up. And you know, when I think across the history, particularly of Westtown, I think about people that I've met that I would have thought sometimes that person, I don't know that they will ever turn their life around. You guys have heard me say it different times. I just don't mind mentioning Mike publicly. But when Mike was, I have to say, at his worst, Mike Hullum, there's several Mikes around, but when he was at his worst, and we'd had a meeting the night before Thanksgiving, and he was living out of his car at that time, not because he didn't have a house, but just because he refused to go home, and because he was just running from God, running from everything. And to be truthful with you, that night when we met, he was actually quite arrogant. I mean, we were friends, but he was fairly arrogant. God's still working on the arrogant part, okay? But anyway, isn't he, Mike? But now 15 years later, but that Thanksgiving, I'll just be honest with you guys, but that night before, I went ahead, even though he was arrogant with me and everything else, I still invited him over to my house for some chili because he was out living in his car. I didn't offer him a bed, that's for sure, because he had one at home. He could have gone home, and he wouldn't do that. And so he came in and ate some chili. My father-in-law was a pastor his whole life, sitting in a chair in the living room. And when Mike walked out the door after that, I said to my father-in-law, I'll be honest with you, I pretty much lost all hope that man will ever turn his life around. And that's how I felt. I didn't want to. I'm not saying I gave up on him, but I felt like giving up on him. I didn't hate him. I just thought the guy will never turn around. See, Mike's just one example of hundreds of people who, over the years of Westtown, have gone down a similar kind of path. Hasn't always been as extreme or as whatever, but people who have doubted the existence of God, who have just hung around with us long enough to come to a point of going, I can't deny it anymore. I cannot deny his existence anymore. I'm gonna let him into my life. I don't know how to do that. I'll just be honest with you. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to take people to a place where they would say, hey, you today would be the day you'll accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. Today will be the day that you will work hard at rebuilding a relationship. Today will be the day that you're going to turn your life around in this way. You're going to address an addiction. Today will be the day. I don't know how to do that. All I know how to do is show up and create environments and have others of us here create environments where we're saying, God, really, it's up to you. We'll do everything that you tell us to. We'll bring our tools. We'll prepare the best we can. But it's up to you. And I just have to tell you, it's been a great, great ride. Not without its challenges and not without its difficulties, but a great, great ride. And not without its sad stories, too, along the way, of those who maybe didn't turn and didn't go God's way. But there have been so many good ones that it creates a joy that is just unbelievable. But I want to tell you this. God's not finished with us yet, okay? And I'm here to announce that. Not that you were thinking he was. You probably wouldn't be here today if you thought that. But I'm gonna share with you 3 mountains that I believe God has put on before us. They've been mountains I've been praying about for. One of them is an ongoing mountain. Will always be an ongoing mountain as long as Westtown exists because it's related to our mission. But the other 2 mountains actually have an end date to them, and right when they're finished, probably new mountains will show up. But the first mountain that I'm going to share with you, that I'm going to invite you to, we're going to create 3 teams within our congregation. And we only want people to sign on to them if you want to. I don't care if it's 3 people or if it's 30 people on a given team. I just know that my sense is that God wants us as a congregation, however wants to involve in that, to actually be praying together for these mountains to be moved. And you say, well, what are the instructions? What are the guidelines? Well, here's what we're going to do today. Today you get to sign up for one of the teams. I'm going to introduce you quickly to the mountain teams, to just the theme of those mountains. And then today you get to mark down what mountain you want to help pray for. And you can use the back of one of the forms in your bulletin, one of the ones that you don't need to take with you, and you can write the mountain you're going to take, and you're going to help us take, and your name and an email address, and we're going to set up a meeting with each team somewhere in the next 2 weeks, and we'll go over all the instructions of how we're going to tackle this mountain together with God's help. And so the first one is a mountain of debt. Thanks, Tom, for calling us dumb and everything. And we know debt's dumb, but we were dumb. We borrowed money. No, we're grateful. We don't feel like we sinned or did anything wrong, anything in that sense. But it's just we've come to believe it's certainly not the wisest path to take. And the Bible talks about giving us some guidance on that. So our goal is to become debt free. And currently, if you look at the back of the bulletin, that equals about $378,000 that we need. We've been faithfully, every time we have any extra in general fund or those who give toward it every month, we're paying that down. We even had a drop in our interest, and we continue paying the mortgage at the same level so that every month that extra goes right toward the principal. We're paying that down just as well and as quickly as we can. In the last 18 months, we've paid down significantly. Been able to do that from some excess funds that were available in general funds. So we appreciate and thank God for each of you who have participated and are participating in helping to do that, either through your faithfulness in tithing, which allows us sometimes to maybe have a little extra we can put toward it, or in your giving extra toward that project. But we're going to take that mountain down with God's help. We're going to take it to the end. And we're going to enlist a team of people who are going to make that a part of your prayer effort. We're going to work together as a team in tackling that mountain. The second mountain, I'm going to share with you, is actually a little bit bigger mountain. It's a mountain that grew on us, actually. It started off as kind of a small mountain, and then it moved to a little bigger mountain, and now it's quite a large mountain. And it's a good thing. If you remember, a little over a year ago, about a year and 3 months ago, we went through a series of messages leading up to what we called Operation Advance. And beginning in July of last year, we had committed, we had a goal of $500,000 to raise for us to be able to do about 15 or 20 projects here at the church. The 2 top projects that had when we took a poll, had people's greatest interest was hiring a full-time youth pastor and hiring a part-time children's pastor. And thank God those are 2 things that we have seen accomplished and as a part of that Operation Advance, even though we've done it without necessarily tapping Operation Advance up to this point. And we're not saying we won't have to in the first months or whatever as we go. But so we set a goal for $500,000 for that. One of the things that we had several projects, and most of these projects hinge on a couple of things. Hinge on us creating new atmospheres or new places, space for our youth ministry and children's ministry. And our initial idea, because our goal was, really even coming into the $500,000, I think initially we were even thinking below that, but to build out some of the building over there and enlarge some of the space. The campaign happened. We had $623,000 committed. And after going back and looking at all of our projects, we saw how we could move forward with youth ministry, with the children's ministry. The building piece of it, we kept talking about that, gaining some insight from other people. And what began to happen was, here's what we began to say, you know what? God's done more than we imagined here, than we thought. And so maybe God is trying to tell us something. And that is that you don't take modular buildings and turn them into bigger, scabbed-on modular buildings that ultimately are going to have to be torn down. And if you're going to invest a few $100,000 in a project, you probably ought to build something that will serve the community of faith and the community at large well for the future. So kind of went back to the drawing boards on that and began to strategize and put together. And a couple of things I want to tell you before I share with you this piece of it. And we've talked about it some, but not really publicly so much. But we've decided that we really need to probably just build a new center for, I think Tom has mentioned a few times in Money Moments, a new youth ministry and youth center. And so we've been working on a design for that. And the reality is that, initially when we were talking about hiring a youth pastor, when we put the money out and everything, I'm feeling a little pressure, like we need to get this thing done. We need to get it done now. We need to get it done. But I want to tell you, and that is this. God has given us in the hearts of Nathan and Kelsey and also Vanjie, hearts that are bent on doing ministry. They're not as the facilities matter and what they do with us. I think anybody that's been involved in children's ministry, you've seen some of the things that Vanjie and different ones of our team have done to really create as positive an atmosphere as possible for the children. If you've just showed up for any of the youth events already, you've seen that they've readjusted those. And Vanjie and Nathan have been meeting together. How can we coordinate these two? How can we've already, if you've ever walked in here during the week and seen some curtains up over here on the side, we've started talking about how we can make use of this space. And one of the things Nathan told me early on is, this youth building I'm looking forward to it. It's wonderful. But I'm going to tell you, that won't stop us from what we're doing. I've already looked around the whole property here. I can tell you once we outgrow this building over here, here's how we'll utilize this building. Here's what we'll do here. And then we'll just be ready to move into that whenever that happens, And so this is no slowdown. So when God brings that building to us, it'll be awesome and it'll be wonderful. But I'm going to tell you, on top of what we've already raised, it's going to take about $1.2 million to accomplish that, because it'll be a 17,000 square foot building that will have the whole upstairs will be entirely geared toward youth ministry. The whole downstairs will be a village for children's ministry that will be unbelievably awesome. But we don't know how and when God will do that. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to put together a ministry team that's going to pray for that mountain to be moved. We're well on our way to that. And most of the other things that need to happen on the list of things that we wrote down for Operation Advance fall right into category of when that happens, those things can come and be fulfilled. And so we're going to push forward toward that and understand with zero debt. We will not dig a shovel in the ground until we feel confident we're at the finish line or within very easy distance of the finish line of raising those funds. So here's what I want to do. I'm just going to give you, just so you have a little bit of perspective, I'm going to ask Aiden, if you would, to put up just a facade picture here of what we're looking at for a youth ministry and a children's ministry building. And so this area over here is what would be that piece coming out in the front would actually come toward the front of this building. But just to give you a little perspective, if you go to the next slide, then that would be kind of face on to that building. And then one more slide, if you would, and that gives you perspective beside that building. It's actually a little bit larger building than this building here itself. And you go, wow, that's going to be it's not bigger in size. It's bigger because it has 2 stories. In that sense, it is wider, but not quite as deep. And so there's a lot we're working on. We've been sitting down with Nathan and with Vanjie and kind of restructuring a lot of things, trying to say, what do these ministries look like 5 years from now? What would they look like 10 years from now? And what would we do? Here's what we do know is nothing is going to stop us from doing the ministry God's called us to do. We don't have to have that building to do it. It'll just help us be able to do it a whole lot better. And then when that building is built, we can get rid of the modular buildings back here and either bless the church with them or have a big bonfire and have marshmallows. But then we plan to put parking over there and everything else. So there's this. Is it a big project? It's a huge project. It's way bigger than I can comprehend. And you say, well, have you guys already invested millions of dollars or in this property? Yes, we have. I mean, we're probably at the $2 million mark right now. And you say, well, wow, this is going to but you know what? I'm still amazed. Listen, I drive on this property. I'm still amazed. This congregation right here and those who, been here before you, that we're sitting in this auditorium and we're on this piece of property. I have no idea. I can remember standing over at our little blue building over in Martinez behind Abilene, where we look like the ugly stepsister if you've ever seen one. I mean, I'm telling you, we were gnarly looking over there. I don't know why in the world anybody ever showed up, but anyway, thank God they did. Here's the deal. I can remember standing there in that rented building and thinking, God, everywhere I've ever pastored, they already had a building. I mean, they already had a parking lot. They had offices. They had all this stuff. How? How will we ever? I mean, we're doing good to pay our light bill. We're doing good for me to even have a meager salary. We're doing. How will we ever get property? How will we ever get a building? And you say, well, now, Rod, can you explain that to us? No, I really can't explain it to you. All except for the good hand of God, his gracious hand. And I believe he's not done. So we're gonna develop that team. The third team will be this, has to do with our mission. For us to reach spiritually running resolved people, help them become fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ. And we're gonna be praying that God will increase our reach according to the mission that he's given to us. We'll go through a lot more detail with regard to that in the days to come. I'd like for you to take the back of a paper in your bulletin, write down one of those mountains. You could either say mission, or building, or debt, whatever strikes your heart. And if it's nothing that strikes your heart, you can wait, because we're not going to meet for a couple weeks, so you can turn it in later. But if you would like to turn it in today, I'd like for you to encourage you to do that if you already have a sense. There's 2 baskets on the little table in the very center in the back. Please place, if you filled it out, please place it in there, and we'll give you more opportunity to sign on as well. And so just, don't be shocked by the numbers. Be amazed by our God. And I'm just anxious to see how he'll do it. I don't know. We're just going to continue on our Operation Advance as it is. We're going to believe God's going to show up in ways we could never imagine or think. And he's going to do things that whenever people see and hear about it, they would have to go, well, there's no way those people could do that. There's no way in the world those folks could do that. But God.